Section: Introduction. In this section, we discuss the linear representation hypothesis, LRH, which suggests that neural networks represent concepts as linear directions. A strong interpretation of the LRH claims that these linear encodings are sufficient for analyzing deep learning models. We present a counterexample to this strong version by demonstrating that gated recurrent units, GRUs, learn to represent tokens based on magnitude rather than direction when performing a simple task of memorizing and generating sequences. This results in what we call onion representations, where we can identify sequence positions by peeling off magnitude changes. In our experiments, we found that smaller networks, with hidden sizes of 48 and 64, only produced these onion representations, while larger networks, with sizes of 128, 512, and 1024, learned to store tokens in position-specific linear subspaces, aligning with the LRH. Interestingly, we discovered that these linear representations could also work alongside onion-based mechanisms. We approached this investigation with specific hypotheses. Our first hypothesis was that GRUs would store each token in a linear subspace. To test this, we used a method called Distributed Alignment Search, DAS, with a Gumbel softmax to select dimensions for intervention. This analysis confirmed that larger GRUs have linear subspaces for each position, but we found no such evidence for the smaller networks. This led us to our second hypothesis, that GRUs learn to represent input big RAMs in linear subspaces. Our DAS analysis supported this for medium-sized models but not for the smallest ones. We then focused on explaining the task success of the smallest models, where we noticed that the update gates of the GRUs decreased as the sequence progressed. This observation led us to our third hypothesis, onion representations. To evaluate this, we conducted interventions on the hidden vector encoding a sequence, replacing one token with another at a specific position. The intervention added a scaled difference of the learned embeddings for the two tokens, with the scaling factor based on the position. This method achieved about 90% accuracy across positions, indicating the presence of layered features stored at different scales. We acknowledge that nonlinear representations are theoretically possible, as any bijective function can be used to featureize a hidden vector. However, most causal analyses of neural networks focus only on linear representations. We hope our counterexample to the strong LRH encourages researchers to explore methods beyond linear encodings, ensuring we do not overlook the diverse concepts and mechanisms learned by our models. In the related work, we note that early research on word vectors was influenced by the idea that linear operations could reveal meaningful structures. The LRH posits that features are represented as directions in vector space and that they are one-dimensional. Some studies have challenged the notion that all features are linearly encoded, suggesting that multiple concepts can exist within a linear subspace at different magnitudes, akin to layers of an onion. We also highlight that recent intervention-based methods have primarily focused on linear representations, providing valuable insights into neural network operations. However, the exploration of nonlinear representations remains limited. Lastly, we mention that recurrent neural networks, RNNs, including GRUs, were among the first architectures for sequential data processing. Although RNNs lost some popularity with the rise of transformer models, they are regaining attention due to structured state space models that aim to improve efficiency in handling sequences. We chose to study GRUs to enhance our understanding of these models. Section Summary. In this section, we challenge the strong linear representation hypothesis, LRH, by demonstrating that smaller gated recurrent units, GRUs, learn to represent tokens using magnitude rather than direction, leading to complex onion representations that cannot be confined to distinct linear subspaces. Our findings suggest that while larger GRUs exhibit linear encodings, smaller models rely on layered features that highlight the need for exploring nonlinear representations in neural networks. Section: Models. In this section, we focus on how recurrent neural networks, RNNs, tackle the repeat task. This topic has gained importance due to the rise of structured state space models that utilize recurrent computations as efficient alternatives to transformers. We define an RNN where the current state depends on the previous state and the current input, starting with an initial state of 0. The output is generated from the current state. We obtain vectorized inputs through a learned embedding, using an index to select the appropriate token for each time step. In our experiments, we prefer GRU cells over the more common LSTM cells because GRUs have a single state to manage, unlike LSTMs which have two. For generating outputs, we apply a softmax function to the current state combined with learned weights and biases. We will examine how the final hidden state of a GRU reflects the input token sequence, acting as a bridge between the input and output. For our repeat task experiments, we aim to understand how different models learn to represent abstract concepts. The repeat task is a straightforward scenario for this exploration. In this task, the network receives a sequence of random tokens, followed by a special token that signals the start of the repeat phase. The goal is to reproduce the input sequence. To set up our experiments, we generate 1 million random sequences for the repeat task, with a maximum length of 9 and 30 possible symbols. We also create an additional 5,000 examples for testing, ensuring they do not overlap with the training set. We maintain consistent model weights during both input and decoding phases, ignoring outputs during input. We use an autoregressive decoding method, where the model's previous output serves as input for the next step. We test various hidden state sizes and train with a batch size of 256 for up to 40,000 iterations, using an AtomW optimizer. Our results indicate that all models successfully solve the repeat task, with only the smallest model slightly underperforming at 95%. This sets the stage for us to investigate how these models achieve this success. We hypothesize that to solve the repeat task, each token's position will correspond to distinct features in the final state vector, which we believe will form linear subspaces. Section Summary. In this section, we focus on how RNNs, specifically GRU cells, tackle the repeat task, where the model learns to reproduce a sequence of random tokens after a special start token. Our experiments show that all models effectively solve this task, with performance peaking at 95% accuracy for the smallest model, setting the stage for further exploration of how these models represent abstract concepts. Section: Interchange Intervention Data. In this section, we discuss interchange interventions, which help us understand how a representation is formed by fixing it to what it would have been if a different input had been used. To do this, we need datasets that include counterfactual examples. We start with a random sequence of elements from our vocabulary and select certain positions randomly, each with a 50% chance of being chosen. We create a base sequence by copying the original and replacing the selected positions with random tokens. For the source sequence, we do the opposite, replacing the unselected positions with random tokens. Our main question is whether we can swap the representations from the base sequence with those from the source sequence to make the model predict the original sequence during decoding. We aim to identify each position in the input sequence with a separate linear subspace. We will assess our success through interchange interventions, replacing the hidden representation of the base sequence with the corresponding values from the source sequence. If we achieve this, it indicates that the network has distinct linear representations for each position. We recognize that the subspaces may not align perfectly, so we employ a method called distributed alignment search to train a rotation matrix that maps the hidden representation into a new space. However, we face the challenge of determining which dimensions in this new space correspond to which positions. The sizes of the subspaces can vary, as some inputs are always present while others may not be, leading the network to allocate more space to important variables. To address this, we learn an assignment matrix that connects dimensions of the new representation to specific sequence positions, allowing some dimensions to remain unassigned for other information, like input length. We define a soft version of this matrix and apply a technique to convert it into a hard assignment. While learning the rotation and assignment matrices, we keep the parameters of the trained GRU network fixed. We perform interventions on the GRU's final state after processing the input sequences and use the original GRU to decode the output from the modified state. We update the rotation and assignment matrices by backpropagating based on the difference between the decoded output and the expected output. For our results, we use the same training and validation sets as the base model. The accuracy of the unigram intervention shows promising results for larger models, indicating that they have separate linear subspaces for each position. However, for smaller autoregressive decoders, our initial hypothesis does not hold, prompting us to seek an alternative explanation for their success, leading us to a new hypothesis. Section Summary. In this section, we describe how interchange interventions are employed to analyze causal abstractions by manipulating input sequences to create counterfactuals, allowing us to evaluate whether different representations can lead to the same output. Our results indicate that larger models can effectively allocate separate linear subspaces for each input position, while smaller autoregressive decoders may require alternative explanations for their success. Section. Hypothesis 2. Byram Variables. In this section, we present our second hypothesis, which is a slight variation of the first. We suggest that instead of using single input variables, our model utilizes pairs of inputs, which we refer to as Byram variables. To create our intervention data, we generate counterfactual pairs using the same approach as in our first hypothesis. Here, each token influences two Byram variables, if they exist. Therefore, when we perform the subspace replacement intervention, we must address both of these variables. This means that for each index in our input, the tokens before and after must match the corresponding Byram variables in the base sequence, as the Byram at one position relies on the current and previous tokens, while the Byram at the current position relies on the current and next tokens. For a sequence of length L, we have L-1 Byram variables. To identify these, we apply the same interchange intervention method we described earlier. Since changing one position in the base input requires replacing two Byram variables, we only intervene on one token at a time. This prevents the new sequence from being too similar to the original and avoids replacing too many subspaces at once, which would make the task easier than intended. Our results demonstrate the effectiveness of Byram interventions, as shown in the middle row of our table. The intervention works well for most sizes, but it does not succeed with the smallest models. We believe that models tend to learn Byram representations due to their advantages in autoregressive input, allowing the current input to be compared with stored pairs to generate output. This could explain how models handle sequences without repeated tokens. However, since our models can also manage tasks with repeated tokens, we suspect there is an additional mechanism at play. We also note that successful unigram interventions lead to successful Byram interventions, as detailed in the appendix. Additionally, we address concerns that our negative results for smaller models might stem from limitations in our approach. The appendix shows that our method works on a non-autoregressive control model, which alleviates these concerns and suggests that the small autoregressive model does not implement the Byram solution, emphasizing the importance of autoregression in this context. However, we still lack an explanation for how the smallest models manage to solve the repeat task, leading us to our third hypothesis. In our third hypothesis, we explore how the smallest GRUs tackle the repeat task by examining the gate values defined in the GRU framework. We visualize the first 64 input gates for a larger model, where we see that this model uses gates to store inputs by sharply closing position-dependent channels, creating a unique subspace for each input. This gating pattern remains consistent across all inputs. In contrast, the gates for the smallest model show a gradual closure, indicating that this network may be encoding token positions. This observation leads us to propose that RNNs learn to represent each position in a sequence as a magnitude. This hypothesis relies on the autoregressive nature of the GRU, the output classifier's ability to discriminate, and the sequential nature of the task. Multiple features can be stored in the same subspace at different scales. When the GRU starts generating tokens, if the scales associated with future positions are small enough, the output classifier can accurately decode the first input token. The model then feeds this token back as input, allowing it to remove the corresponding scaled representation and focus on the next token. We refer to these representations as onion representations, as they resemble layers that can be peeled back to reveal sequence positions. This hypothesis diverges from linear representations, where tokens are directions and each position has its own subspace. In onion representations, tokens share the same direction regardless of position, with the magnitude indicating the position. Consequently, if the same token appears in multiple positions, it will be added with different scaling factors. Moreover, since the memory is a sum of scaled token embeddings, isolating the position linked to a specific scale is impossible. Only the token with the highest scale can be extracted at any time, matched to a dictionary of token directions by the final classifier. The autoregressive feedback in GRUS effectively peels off each layer, granting access to the next variable. We provide a simple implementation of the onion solution in the appendix to clarify these concepts. Section Summary. In this section, we propose that our model utilizes Byram variables, which are pairs of consecutive inputs, to enhance its representation capabilities. We demonstrate that while Byram interventions are generally effective, smaller models struggle with this approach, leading us to explore the concept of onion representations, where tokens are encoded by magnitude rather than direction, allowing for the sequential extraction of information through autoregressive feedback. Section: Intervention Data. In this section, we focus on the intervention data for analyzing onion representations. Instead of using interchange interventions, we create an embedding matrix for each token that captures how the model represents that token in its hidden state. To replace a token in a sequence, we calculate the difference between the embeddings of the new and old tokens, adjusting this difference based on the target position. Our aim is to modify the hidden representation so that the decoded sequence includes the new token. For our method, when we replace a token, we scale the difference of the embeddings by a factor related to its position. We define the embedding for the tokens separately from the GRU input embedding, and we learn scaling parameters. The scaling factor is primarily influenced by an exponential term. Different channels in the hidden state may have varying scales. Our results show that the onion intervention significantly outperforms unigram and bigram interventions, achieving 87% accuracy compared to just 1% for the bigram intervention when using a model with 64 dimensions. If we fix certain parameters, our accuracy drops to 21%. We explore why GRUs learn onion representations. To differentiate a set number of tokens across possible positions, the model must recognize numerous directions in the feature space. In our experiments, we found 300 directions in a 64-dimensional space, while onion representations only need to distinguish between 30 directions. We also train various probes to decode the final representation after processing the input sequence with GRUs. Our probes predict the entire sequence at once, and we verify that decoding is straightforward with the autoregressive probe. However, if an onion representation is learned, it cannot be decoded without autoregressive input, unlike models trained without it. The feature space of an onion representation consists of the learned embeddings and the probe that predicts the token sequence, forming an encoder that projects the hidden vector into a new feature space. The first features correspond to the token embeddings, while the last feature represents the remaining hidden state. The inverse process involves a weighted sum of these features. Although our probe has high accuracy, there is still some reconstruction loss when applying the featurizer and its inverse. This onion feature space is defined by token embeddings, a dynamic scaling factor, and a probe, allowing for modular interventions on each feature. Section Summary. In this section, we describe our method for causal analysis of onion representations by learning an embedding matrix for each token, allowing us to replace tokens in a sequence through scaled differences in their embeddings. Our results demonstrate that this onion intervention significantly outperforms traditional unigram and bigram interventions, achieving up to 87% accuracy, and we established that the learned onion representations require autoregressive decoding for effective reconstruction. Section: Our embedding-based interventions are equivalent to onion interchange interventions. In this section, we discuss how our embedding-based interventions are similar to onion interchange interventions. We examined the linear representations of large networks using interchange interventions that fixed a linear subspace to the value it would have if a different token sequence were input. There is a related interchange intervention for onion representations. Interestingly, we found that these onion interchange interventions are equivalent to the scaled difference of embeddings we used in our experiments. We also explore why onion interventions are effective on large models. We were surprised to find that the onion intervention performs well on large models with linear representations of position, specifically when the size is greater than or equal to 256. We believe this happens because all models begin with gates open and then close them in a consistent, sequential way as they process the input. This allows the scaling-based onion intervention to closely mimic the actual gating pattern, enabling it to work effectively. While the intervention cannot create very sharp gate transitions, it can adjust for them by forming an ensemble with different decay factors for various channels. From our findings in the appendix, we observe that the onion intervention performs significantly worse on smaller non-autoregressive models that use linear representations compared to autoregressive ones. This outcome is expected since the onion intervention cannot replicate the arbitrary gating patterns that these smaller models may learn.